On today's show, what did Ime Udoka mean when he referred to the Houston Rockets as a fragile ecosystem? Was he talking about the offense, the defense, or kind of all of it? Plus, what are some of the biggest barriers to success for the Houston Rockets post-All-Star break this season? It's all coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Thursdays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets, where the best way you can help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing. Like and subscribe on YouTube. Drop a comment while you're there. Just do a drive-by, say Go Rockets. Helps us out a ton. Subscribe to the daily Locked On Rockets newsletter. And as always, thanks so much for making this show part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you so much for being an everydayer. And joining us now is your weekly co-host, the podfather himself, Rockets Wire editor and host of the Logger Line podcast, Ben DuBose. You can track down on Twitter at Ben DuBose. Also make sure to check out rocketswire.usatoday.com for all of your Houston Rockets coverage. Ben, joining us at a delicate time, dare I say fragile time, to talk about this Houston Rockets team. Fresh off a 6-game losing streak, they did get things, I can't quite say back on track with the win against the Toronto Raptors. They're kind of limping to the finish line that is the All-Star break right now. We're going to talk about some big picture stuff in today's show. Some of the comments coming from Ime Udoka in particular. We'll get to his comment about the Rockets and their quote-unquote fragile ecosystem that they have a little bit later in the show. We're going to run that clip back. But I want to start things off with the comment that Ime made last week after the loss to the Minnesota Timberwolves, where Anthony Edwards just took over down the stretch of that game. 16 fourth quarter points, literally matched the Rockets point for point himself in that fourth and final frame. And afterwards, Ime Udoka did highlight and say, it's nice when you have a special player who can just go out and get buckets, right?
Yep.
What was your kind of read on that comment from Ime? Because I kind of took it to, like, you could just take it at face value and be like, okay, he's very impressed by Ant. You can also maybe dive a little bit deeper into what that comment means and as it relates to and kind of maybe a reflection of the Houston Rockets and kind of what they don't have, I guess, right?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a reflection of that. We've talked about the need for an A1 all season long, and congratulations to Alperen Sengun for growing into an all-star this year. But I think the Rockets are still waiting for an all-NBA level player, that Anthony Edwards type. I don't think it's a shot at Sengun to say he's not at that level yet. Neither is Jalen Green, neither is Thompson. They're hoping that one or more of those guys, or perhaps one of the other 4 young guys in the core 7, develops into that caliber of player, but none of them are quite to that level just yet. And so when you see your opposition do that down the stretch of a game in which the Rockets played well, they wanted to end the losing streak, and then it felt like Anthony Edwards just single-handedly put his team on his back and got them to the finish line. Yeah, I think it's a natural reflection of the Rockets roster. We've talked about it before, the need for an A1, but I also think it dovetails with what Ime said over the weekend regarding the fragile ecosystem, regarding the injuries being the biggest variable. Because when you have a player like Anthony Edwards or like James Harden a few years ago here in Houston, one of the really useful things about having a player of that caliber is that it can cover up so many other weaknesses when you have those moments of individual greatness. Whereas the current Rockets, when you take a couple of links out of the chain, Fred VanVleet and the organization limiting turnovers, Jabari Smith with the defense and the rebounding. The Rockets have been one of the worst defensive rebounding teams in the NBA since losing Jabari at the beginning of January. And so when you don't get rebounds, it takes away from your ability to defend at a top 5 level, which was the foundation of this team for the first 2.5 months. And for the first 2 or 3 weeks of January, you had both Jalen Green and Thompson in something closer to that A1 form. And I think that covered up the regression defensively. Lately, it's not that Jalen and Amen have regressed hard. They've regressed a little bit, but that little bit of regression coupled with the defense being mediocre instead of really good gives you these results to where you're losing the coin flip games that earlier in the year you were winning, and all of a sudden it snowballs, especially with 5 games in 7 days. I just think when you have someone at the level of Anthony Edwards, you can have a lot of things go wrong, but when that guy puts your team on his back down the stretch of a close game, all the problems sort of go on the back burner if you win. as opposed to when you don't have the individual greatness to get you a win, it's easier for things to snowball, and it's easier for these little ripple effects to take on greater prominence. That's how I would describe it. It's, it's not that Minnesota doesn't have issues. Obviously, they have their share. There's a reason they have a worse record than the Rockets, but they do have the ability in a given game, and of course, that's what Ime was commenting on, to sort of put those on the back burner based on Anthony Edwards putting the team on his back. The Rockets don't, and in stretches of the schedule where they aren't healthy, they're missing these key players, and just logistically, you've got a lot of back-to-backs, you've got 5 games in 7 nights, just rough on a number of levels. The Rockets don't have the individual brilliance to transcend it in a given game the way a team like the Timberwolves and Anthony Edwards do.
Yeah, they're not a team throughout this season and really at all under the Ime Udoka era who's been able to win just on sheer talent alone is the problem. And you see other teams that are capable of doing that in those moments of brilliance, like the Anthony Edwards game that we saw recently.
Or Jalen Brunson.
Jalen Brunson, another one, right? His takeover at the end of that Knicks game was phenomenal. Or teams like, the Boston Celtics who have all that top heavy talent and they can just kind of decide to flip a switch when they want to and turn it on and just kind of coast through a game and then, play well for a quarter, right? This Rockets team has to play well and has to maintain that identity for all 4 quarters. I know you, at least on social media, you've kind of gone back and forth about this, about the Rockets trade deadline and they decided ultimately not to go for a big move or a blockbuster type deal or picking up a name like a Kevin Durant or whatever to kind of make a certified push this season for potential, title contention, whatever. Where are you now that we're, a little bit removed from the deadline? How do you feel about that? Because I catch myself going back and forth on it, right? Like, is it the right move to be patient? Was it the wrong move to not do something? I'm back and forth on it.
Yeah, I go back and forth as well. I think I'm okay with the path they took because ultimately when you zoom out, seeing these losses, when they happen in the moment and you're coming off, basically a week removed from feeling like you're a legitimate contender, beating the Cavs twice and then the Celtics, it's a bitter pill to swallow. But at the same time, you do have to take a step back and realize, hey, if this team is capable of losing 6 games in a row, they're probably not at the level yet where they can realistically beat the Oklahoma City Thunder, assuming health, 4 times out of 7. And so if the team isn't at that level yet, then it doesn't make sense to push your chips in for a good player who, while they might address a weakness, you would be a better team with Kevin Durant, with Jimmy Butler, with De'Aaron Fox. If it's not the ideal long-term fit for one reason or another, age, contractual status, size, whatever the case may be, roster fit, if it's not the optimal fit that checks all the boxes, then if you can't actually win a championship this year, you're probably better off because it's so damn hard to be the last team standing out of 30, waiting for a guy that checks more boxes. So if you could have gotten a guy like that for cheap, then sure. But I think it's pretty clear that none of them went for especially cheap. And so if you're going to be talking about investing a lot of your future asset capital, I think you need someone that checks more boxes than those guys do. Because ultimately, what I think this streak reminds you, it's not that all of a sudden fans should panic and think that the Rockets are going to fall to the play-in tournament and miss the playoffs altogether. No, but it is a little bit of cold water on perhaps the idealistic version of the Rockets that we all wanted to buy into after that stretch in January where they beat the Grizzlies twice, they beat the Cavs twice, they beat the Celtics. This is a reminder that this team is fragile, to use Ime's words. They're not so loaded that they are ready to go toe-to-toe with the Thunder, with the Celtics in a best of 7 this year. So because of that, when you zoom out, when you think not just the short-term panic, but the long-term, when does it actually make sense to cash your chips in? I don't think they're at a point this year where it makes sense to do that unless the fit checks every single box, both short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And I just don't see who was available at the deadline that would have done that.
Speaking of fragile, let's hear the commentary from Ime Udoka himself and take a big picture look at this team. What are going to be some of the biggest barriers to success for the Rockets post All-Star break? We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by WayFair. Look, after the holiday hustle, there's nothing like giving your home a little TLC. I usually find that decluttering and refreshing my space helps me get back into a solid routine. Whether you're tidying up, clearing out, or just want to give your space a new look to start the year, WayFair has everything you need, all within your budget. I was recently looking for some furniture, and their huge selection made it so easy to find pieces that fit my style and budget. My favorite part, the free and hassle-free delivery, even for larger items. WayFair's site was so easy to navigate, and I found everything I needed in absolutely no time. Give your home the refresh that it needs with WayFair. Head to wayfair.com right now. That's WayFair, WayFair.com. WayFair, every style, every home. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, Ben, we've alluded to this clip a couple times now. Let's hear the full clip of Ime Udoka talking about this Houston Rockets quote-unquote fragile ecosystem before the Raptors game on Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, I've said it. We got our ecosystem is kind of fragile, and it's a team that relies on each other. It's not just relying upon one person, and so when you look at our leading scorer being around 20, 21, and then Alperen right behind Jalen, we're not putting it in somebody's hands every night to do it. And you see the importance of Jabari being out, obviously Fred being out, and then Alperen when he missed the games. And so as tough as the schedule's been with the 13 and 17 on the road, or all the back-to-backs we have kind of piled up now, I think it's more so the injuries and how it throws us off a little bit as far as what we require certain people to do and people being put in other roles.
Now, Ben, in segment one, you used the analogy, links in a chain, right? And so this Rockets team, going back all the way to, I don't know, like the 2004 Pistons kind of, right? Even though I think you could make a very strong argument. Obviously, Chauncey Billups, incredible player, definitely, all-star worthy caliber, all NBA maybe borderline all NBA. I don't know. Like I'm not trying to besmirch Chauncey Billups' career here, but Billups was a good player. But that Pistons team, right, was kind of greater than the sum of its parts. And it feels like this Rockets team has kind of taken on a little bit of that kind of mantra, that mentality, the whole, sometimes you, sometimes me, always us kind of mantra. But we've talked about at various points this season that it's kind of a double-edged sword for this Rockets team. And I wonder if, obviously, the injuries, the schedule, all the things that Ime alluded to are definitely factors that are worth considering. But I can't help but wonder if this particular stretch of the schedule has necessarily, do you think it's exposed anything about this Rockets team? Because I think it's for one amplified the whole lack of a closing element, the closing or a closer, I should say, for this team. But it's also really put a magnifying glass on just how rough the offensive side of things can get for this Rockets squad. Even when, because, I don't know how many different times teams have been throwing out zone defenses now against Ime, and it seems like there's never a concrete answer, and that feels like a distinct lack of coaching and schematic adjustment for the Rockets to look like they just don't know how to handle a zone defense when it gets put in front of them.
Well, I think, as with most things in professional sports, there's not an easy way to do it. Otherwise, every team would do it. It's competitive sports at the highest level. And so we talk a lot about the strengths of this approach, which I think the diverse attack that this Rockets team has, it makes them less predictable. This is not the James Harden Rockets where we know what they're going to try and do down the stretch of a game, and it's just about whether James can do that. They attack in different ways. And so I think it keeps the defense on their toes a little bit. That's the glass half full. The glass half empty way to look at it is that as a season progresses and there's more tape, teams are going to be able to hone in a little bit more on what the Rockets want to do and what can take them out of, the sets that they're most effective in. Even teams like this that attack in different ways over 82 games do get a little bit more predictable, especially when you lose a few of those parts due to injuries, which has happened in the last few weeks. So I think the sample size increasing has reduced the unpredictability element. I also think you're seeing at times the Rockets can struggle to get players in rhythm. One of the benefits, if you have a heliocentric offense like the the Rockets did with James Harden, or the Timberwolves did last week with Anthony Edwards, or the Knicks with Jalen Brunson. It's very easy for those players to get in rhythm because they're constantly getting the touches they need. They can feel out a game, see how opponents are defending them, and then get to their spots. And we saw that increasingly on that road trip where it felt like with Brunson and Ant in particular, by the fourth quarter, it felt like they knew exactly how and where they wanted to attack and when, against even good defenders like Amin Thompson, like Tari Eason, like Dillon Brooks, and the Rockets didn't really have counters. As opposed to this sometimes you, sometimes me, always us, there are times where it feels like Alperen Sengun isn't getting the touches he needs to be in rhythm, and that could be a factor in why he's missed more bunnies this season. I'm sure Jalen Green could get a better feel for driving to the bucket and getting to the free throw line if he was getting more consistent opportunities, and so on and so forth. And I'm not going to sit here and say there's an easy answer to this, but I think as with any strategy, there are pros and there are cons. The pros, I think it keeps defenses on their toes more, and especially early in the year, the Rockets benefited from it, especially on a team that doesn't have a clear all-NBA level player to begin with. But as the season progresses, and especially as you've lost a few supporting pieces, like Jabari and especially Fred on the offensive end, because he's so important for organizing your sets and minimizing turnovers and preventing the transition leakouts that go the other way, I think you're starting to see, again, there's more tape on the Rockets. And I also think this issue of a lack of rhythm is becoming more and more paramount, especially in a stretch of the schedule where Alp, Jalen, they're all struggling with nagging injuries on top of everything, and they're not 100%.
One of the things that I struggle with, though, is it feels like I'm torn because it feels like the Rockets do have what could be a very clear established hierarchy in Jalen Green, Alperen Sengun. Take your pick, 1A, 1B, whatever, right? Like either one of them on any given night, one of them should be the leading shot getter, and then the second one should be the second leading shot getter. Like that's your dynamic duo. That should be the duo that the offense is kind of catered around, built around, to where as long as those guys are each getting anywhere from 20 to 25 attempts a night, and if they're each getting 20 to 25 attempts, it feels like you're giving yourself the best possible chance for kind of the best of both worlds, right? For those guys to get the requisite touches that they need to get in rhythm over the course of the game. You know, there's going to be stretches where it's, you know, Jalen's turn to cook, and then there's going to be stretches where Alperen Sengun is out there without Jalen, right? There's plenty of runway for those guys to each get up, you know, north of 20 shot attempts on a given night. I go back to the Dallas,
especially if your 20 includes free throws, because, you know, 20 plus shot attempts for two different players in the same team can be tough to get to by counting stats. But if you include the trips that don't technically count as shots because they get free throws, then yeah. I
mean, like, well, let me use, just using the Dallas game as an example, right? Jalen attempted 21 shots, 10 of 21, had 24 points. Alp, 19 shots, 30 points, hit 11 of 19, right? Now, maybe that's not quite sustainable on a night-to-night basis. Maybe they would come a little bit short of that. But I guess I just mean like the idea of that hierarchy being,
I got you.
Like, to me, the issues come from when you have games where, you know, you've got, you know, Dillon Brooks or Amin Thompson or, you know, Cam Whitmore off the bench taking more shot attempts than one of your two best players. Like, that's the stuff where I think Ime has to step in from a coaching perspective and really put his foot down and make sure, hey, we need this ball to go through Jalen. We need this ball to go through Alperen Sengun. And sometimes some of that's going to be a result of the defensive focus and attention that those guys generate. I understand that, but there's just too many points throughout this season where we've seen other guys really have their moments for like, all right, it's my turn to cook, or I'm going to take over. And, you know, Dillon Brooks is notorious for having moments like that. Cam Whitmore checks in off the bench and has plenty of moments like that. We also see moments where other guys get a ton of shots up, and if they, you know, maybe it feels like wasted possessions, right? Where you give Steven Adams, you know, 6 or 7, 8 different shot attempts around the rim. Some of those are offensive putbacks. I get that, but I don't know. I don't know what I guess could be done at this point from an offensive identity perspective to shift things over, because while I understand that Ime doesn't have that star player to work with, I feel like he does have two blossoming star, like all-star caliber talents in both Alperen Sengun and Jalen Green, and at no point on any given night should those two guys really take a backseat to anybody else on the Rockets roster, except for maybe Amin Thompson when he's really got it going, when a defense can't contain him, or if Fred or Dillon has a big night, then sure, you can ride the hot hand a little bit. But I think there just needs to be a better emphasis placed on, right, like incorporating your two best players into everything that you do and making sure that they get the biggest pieces of the pie. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it is. So what you're telling me is you want fewer Fred VanVleet grenade threes down the stretch of a close game.
Yeah, a little bit. That'd be nice. Can we get away from those? That'd be fantastic. I'd be all for that.
Yeah. No, I had a little bit of a sticker shock, if you will, when you mentioned 20 plus attempts per game for both, because I don't think there are very many teammates in the NBA period that average 20 plus attempts per game, but more than they're getting now and getting closer to that ballpark. Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think it's just a natural evolution of this team, because compared to when Ime Udoka took over at the start of last season, Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun are both clearly better players right now. And I think because so much of the offense they installed goes back to the 2023 offseason, it was based on who they were then. But we're getting to a point, I think Sengun took the leap last year, and now Jalen has clearly gotten better throughout this year. Maybe you are at the point where you sit guys like Dillon, like Fred down over the All-Star break. We saw a year ago, that was the point in which the Rockets did tweak their offense. They came back from the All-Star break, shooting more threes, playing with more pace. I think that played into Jalen Green going on the run he went on last March. Perhaps you see that now as well, because you don't just have one player. I think it can be a little bit challenging if Sengun is the only one who's broken out, because, well, teams can just start to defend you a little bit more towards the rim and dare you to make more threes. But now that you have guys that are taking a step both on the inside and on the perimeter, then maybe you can tweak the system a little bit to emphasize, especially in high leverage moments, those guys to run more offense through them. I think that's something that they can and should explore over the All-Star break. Nothing dramatic, but just sort of tweaking, especially the high leverage moments, saying, hey, unless you're really cooking, unless some action is really to the team's advantage based on the way a defense is defending in a given night, then it makes more sense to run through Jalen and Sengun, because you have two guys who are developing that are clearly still getting better month over month relative to where they started when Ime Udoka installed this offense. Yeah, maybe you can sell me. It's the time to consider some changes like that over the week-long All-Star break. One other point that I would raise you as far as the fragile ecosystem, I do think a lot of the comments refer to the offensive end of the court, but I think at least to a small extent, they apply defensively as well. The Rockets, we talk about their lack of an A1 scorer offensively, but defensively, they also don't have that consistent defensive player of the year caliber player. We hope Amin Thompson will be that, but he is just year two. And I think there has been some slippage, taking him from a 28 to 30 minutes per game, Swiss Army knife sixth man to a 38 to 40 minutes per game starter. I think that's a challenge for anyone, especially a newly turned 22-year-old in his second NBA season. He hasn't suddenly become a bad defender, but he's not quite at the level that he was when he was playing 28 to 30 minutes per game. I think that played a role in why he wasn't able to slow Anthony Edwards and Jalen Brunson more than he did on that last road trip. Am I panicking about it? No, I think it's natural. You should expect that. I think he'll get better. I think this is a normal part of sort of the conditioning challenges with a young player. But even Amin, as good as he is not quite to that defensive player of the year right now level. And beyond that, you have a lot of good pieces defensively, but you don't have any truly transcendent ones. It's more about how it works collectively, how they work together. And that's why Fred VanVleet, you don't think of Fred as a perimeter stopper anymore, but he is so important from a communication standpoint, not just offensively, but defensively as well. So when you take some of those pieces out and you remove the depth, all of a sudden you see the defense go from top five to all of a sudden mediocre to even a little bit below mediocre since the calendar turned to 2025. So I do think the fragile ecosystem is mostly talking about offense, but defensively as well. I think it's a similar concept in that the Rockets have a lot of very good pieces. They don't really have any elite pieces just yet. And so because of that, when you take away one or two of those links from the chain, there can be all these ripple effects in a way that you might not see if you have an MVP level difference maker on one side of the court or the other.
Coming up, we're going to get into what are the biggest barriers to success for the Houston Rockets the rest of the way this season. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Open Phone. Look, running a small business means wearing a lot of different hats. Your personal phone becomes your business phone, and before you know it, you're juggling customer calls day and night. As your team grows, it becomes impossible to manage everything with just your personal number. That's where Open Phone comes in. It's the #1 business phone system designed to help you keep your work and personal lives separate. For just $15 a month, the cost of a few cups of coffee, you get complete transparency and visibility into everything happening with your business phone number. Open Phone works through an app on your phone or computer and integrates with tools like HubSpot and hundreds of others. It also uses AI-powered call transcripts and summaries, so you'll have a rundown of your calls and action items the second that you hang up. And if you miss a call, no problem. Automated messages are sent directly to your customer, ensuring you never miss an opportunity to engage. Right now, OpenPhone is offering 20% off your first 6 months when you go to openphone.com/lockedonnba. That's OpenPhone, OPENPHONE.com/lockedonnba for 20% off of 6 months. Openphone.com/lockedonnba. And if you have existing numbers with another service, OpenPhone will port them over at no extra charge. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, Ben, at the time that we are recording this podcast, the Rockets are currently sitting at 5th place in the Western Conference. They are 1 loss behind the LA Lakers, so they've lost home court advantage, at least temporarily here while we're recording. When you look at kind of the landscape of the rest of this season for the Rockets, I think for a little while there, it felt like we were maybe playing with some house money with how successful this team had been up to that point. It kind of almost feels like we were bound for a crash back down to earth, right? Like we were going to regress at some point, and maybe not expecting a regression as hard as the 6-game slide with some really, really painful losses to the Brooklyn Nets mixed in there. But, it felt like this team was maybe playing a little bit higher, above where we thought they were going to be, and that there would be some kind of, return to form, so to speak. When you look at how the rest of the season you think is going to play out and any potential postseason run or whatever, what are some of the barriers to success you think this team is going to be faced with as we navigate the final 1/3 or so of the season and any potential playoff run?
Yeah. And for starters, when it comes to the playoffs, I'm mainly at this point focused on avoiding the play-in tournament. I think you've got to stay in the top 6 because a lot of their trade deadline strategy, staying the course with the young core, was that you will benefit so much from learning more about these guys by stress testing them and seeing what happens when they go in high leverage situations. And so at least getting one series, a true best of 7, not just a play-in game or anything that happened in, a 1-game sample size, but giving them a best of 7 and hopefully more than one best of 7 because we hope they advance. That's what's most important. And as long as they're in the top 6, I can live with that because there's some scenarios. Would I like them to have home court advantage? Sure, but this is not last year's team. They function fine on the road, this last road trip excluded, because obviously they're very weary and just shorthanded at this point. I think there's worlds where you might prefer to be the 6th seed rather than the 4 or 5 because you'd be on the opposite side of the bracket from the Thunder. And I don't know about you, Jackson, but I'd probably rather play Memphis in the first round than I would a team like the Lakers with both LeBron and Luka, or the Nuggets with Nikola Jokic, because we know the problem the Rockets have with a lack of star power, the things we've discussed, not being able to sort of have those individual moments of brilliance that lead you to wins. I might take my chances against Memphis, a team the Rockets are 3-1 against and could easily be 4-0, as opposed to drawing Luka and LeBron and the Lakers in round 1 and then being set up to play the Thunder in round 2 because you're on that 4-5 line, which will slot against the 1-8. So for me at this point, with the Rockets playing fairly well on the road, except for the last road trip, I'm not too worried about, exactly what seed they are, as long as they get in the playoffs. And right now they have a 3-game lead plus the tiebreaker over the team in the 7 slot, which is the LA Clippers. That would feel pretty good about this. Rockets have an easier schedule than everyone in the West, except for the Mavericks as well. So I think all in all, they're still in a pretty good spot unless they have a catastrophic downturn in form. And so what would cause them to have that catastrophic downturn to where they blow a lead that right now is effectively at 4 or 5 games over the teams in the play-in tournament range over the final 25 or so after the All-Star break? I would say it's the health of Fred VanVleet. That's what I'm watching the most. A lot of the injuries and really the recent downturn, it's correlated with the injuries. So the obvious question is, are these guys that are hurt going to be back? I'm not worried about the guys that have bone issues. Jabari Smith Jr., non-shooting hand. We've seen the cast come off. He's shooting. My expectations on the other side of the All-Star break, he's going to be ready to go. Jalen Green, the contusion to his knee. give him a week off. That's going to be fine. Alperen Sengun, the contusion to his calf. Again, that's a bruise. Give him a few days off. Hopefully the back spasms aren't that bad. Ime Udoka seems to, at least from the comments that we know as of our recording date, doesn't seem to be too concerned about that. So I think most of your injured guys are going to be fine. Steven Adams, Tari, Eason, they were injured last year. We knew that there were going to be some growing pains with getting them back up to speed. So I'm not too alarmed with any of them. The one issue I am watching is Fred VanVleet, because when you talk about, an ankle injury to something involving the tendons, it's not a given that he's going to be back. And we have seen on both ends of the court, the organization, the communication, limiting turnovers, getting the Rockets in their sets, in their actions. There is no one else on this team that can do what Fred does. He is so important to them on both ends of the court. I know the traditional stats don't show it, but he is still clearly, in my opinion, a top 50 player in the NBA based on his impact, a very useful piece. There's a reason why at the deadline it leaked that the Rockets are considering, a multi-year extension with Fred, because he is still that important to what they do. And so even if we want to scale down his role a little bit at times offensively, on the balance, he is extremely important. And yet when you talk about a multi-week ankle injury, it's not a given that he is going to come back to full health this year. I think he probably will, but I think the Rockets are going to have to manage it very carefully. And so when he comes back, be it immediately after the All-Star break or longer, how close to 100% is he? That's what I'm going to be watching, because I think the Rockets, if they are healthy, there's enough of a sample size that they're going to be fine when combined with the buffer that they have to stay in that top six, get to the playoffs. And then at that point, it's just, let's see what happens in the playoffs and learn, for better or for worse, what this team does under the highest leverage moments. I think in terms of what can go wrong, it's Fred VanVleet and that ankle. That's what I'm watching the most. And so knock on wood, hopefully he's good to go. If he is, I think this team is going to be fine.
Hang on, where is it?
Man, he's a beast, man. We need him to play like that every night.
There we go. I knew I had a Fred soundbite somewhere. Look, I could honestly live with a world where post All-Star break, they bring Fred back and keep him on a minutes restriction, right? Keep, 25, 30 minutes a night max. Don't let him overexert it, right? Wrap it in bubble wrap, whatever, because you're absolutely right. He's incredibly important to this team. There's a few different guys on this team. Nobody can do what Fred can do. Nobody can do what Jalen can do. Nobody can do what Alp can do. There are other guys on the roster that there's some, duplications of skill sets and whatnot, but those three guys in particular, nobody else on the roster. And somebody might be like, oh, well, Cam can get buckets like Jalen can get. Cam can't handle and play make the way that Jalen can, right? Nobody can do what Fred. So those three guys are so unique, and missing any one of them for any amount of extended period of time just adversely hurts this roster so much. And Fred, I think more than anybody, because it's really, really hard to replicate what he brings. And you make a great point, right? The counting stats don't do it justice. A lot of it's
And by the way, we should point out that two of their best wins of the year, OKC and Cleveland, were games in which Fred absolutely went off. So Fred is the guy. He has that gear. It's not reasonable to expect him to do it every game, especially at 30 years old, but he can lift this team to another level. And so if he's not available, if he's not right, that dramatically reduces your ceiling, because he's a guy that, again, you can't count on it every single night, but he can potentially swing a playoff series if you get a couple of those games like Fred had against the Thunder, Fred had against the Cavs, and all of a sudden that can be the difference in whether you advance or you don't.
Absolutely. No, fantastic points. Look, I come away, and I've talked about this so many different times, and I really do, I want to give them the chance to finish off the season, and I want to give them the chance to prove me wrong. I want Ime to have the chance to prove me wrong here, but I really do wonder if we're going to look at the end of this season, and if we see another subsequent drop off in production from the defensive perspective, from the physicality, from the intensity that this team is able to play with. Yes, a chunk of that is due to injuries. Yes, the chunk of that is missing the links in the chain, so to speak. But I wonder if there's something to the idea of, it's just impossible to sustain that level of physicality and intensity over the course of an 82-game season. That eventually fatigue is going to set in. Your players are not going to be able to maintain that level of effort on a night in, night out basis. And this team does not have a great margin for error, right? They have a certain few win conditions that they've needed to meet pretty consistently to be able to be the high level team that they've been this season. The turnovers being a weird one. The whole they're undefeated when they turn the ball over more than 20 times. That's such a weird stat flaw that goes completely counter to the point that I'm trying to make here. But right, they take care of the basketball, they rebound, they offensive rebound, they generate second chance points, and they defend at a high level. That's how they've made their identity this season. And unfortunately, We saw it last season. The defense plummeted post All-Star break. And some of that coincided with losing Alperen and Sengun and having to go with Jabari Smith Jr. as their starting five and inserting him in Thompson and faster pace. Like there were a lot of other factors to consider. But I think one of the biggest ones is we saw this team last season. Same thing that's happening now. We saw them wearing down as the season went along. And I wonder if there's something to that. And I hope I'm proven wrong. I hope that this team can get healthy post All-Star break. Everybody gets back in the rotation and the defense gets back to form the way that it needs to, and they're able to close out the season strong. But I also think some of their success in that month of March was predicated on they were one of the best offensive teams in the NBA. They were the fourth best offensive team in the month of March, coincided with they had I think like sixth or seventh best defense, but that defense continued to taper off as the season went along. So, and that doesn't factor in the struggles in February, and then also the struggles they had in April to actually close out the year. So I really want to see this team prove me wrong, and I want to see, okay, this is an identity and a mentality and a culture that can stay consistent for an entire year. Because right now, that's my biggest concern, and that's, I think, the biggest barrier to success, I think, for this team is, will they have enough in the tank to get back to how they were defending and how they were playing earlier this season? And will that necessitate, right, moving Amin Thompson back to the bench? Maybe he's best served in that bench role where he only gets 30 to 32 a night, and he's able to play with a lot more intensity and energy in that role, playing alongside Tari, Eason, bringing back the Terror Twins, right? Kind of that iteration of the team. I don't know. That's kind of one of the bigger things that I'm looking at for the end of the season.
It's a fair question. I would say one source for optimism, besides the team being a little bit deeper this year and getting healthier, is that with the exception of Amin and Cam, and Cam's role is pretty small at this point, all of your core players are year 3 or beyond. And so you're much closer to having a full rotation of guys that are used to an 82-game season. Because to your point, I think one thing a lot of fans forget about younger players, there is such a huge gap between the NBA and college ball, or the NBA and any other league, in terms of the totality of the games. And this is the stretch of the schedule where if your team is especially young, the way most of Houston's rotation is, guys start wearing down because they are not used to playing for months on end, 3, 4, even 5 games in a week. 82 games instead of the 35 that you play in college. It is a huge increase that when guys are rookies, even in their second year, and to a small extent in year 3, their bodies are just not ready for the rigors of an NBA season. Even if they think they are, even if they're doing things right in the offseason, it takes time to put your body through that grind before you adapt. I think beyond the team getting healthier, you have a team that is getting a little bit older. And I think they're getting to a stretch now where it's reasonable to expect them to have a little bit more in the tank defensively going into February, March, and hopefully beyond. I think this team is one that will disproportionately benefit from the games being more meaningful, getting closer to the playoffs. And the last point that I would raise, Matt Moore, HP Basketball on Twitter, has made the point a lot in the NBA that March is a ragged month around the league because you have the time off for the All-Star break and the contenders are getting ready for the playoffs. For me, that's a stretch in which the Rockets, if they can get back to their identity on paper, they should get back to who they were early in the year in terms of having the effort advantage. I do think that's eroded a little bit as the year has progressed and more of your veteran teams are trying hard the way maybe they weren't in October and November. In March, I do think around the league, you see effort, especially amongst contenders, wane a little bit. On paper, if that's a stretch where the Rockets are healthy and they do have more home games coming up, this is one where maybe they should be able to make some hay, especially with a team that doesn't have as many super young guys in the rotation that aren't as used to the grind as they need to be. So knock on wood, to your point, they've got to actually do it. But on paper, I like how it sets up for this year to be a little bit different on that front.
We want your thoughts on everything we talked about in today's show. What are your thoughts on Ime Udoka's comments about star players and the fragile ecosystem of the Rockets? Give us your thoughts on everything we discussed in the show. What do you think are the biggest barriers to success for this team closing out this season and beyond? Let us know in the comments. Ben, let everyone know where they can track you down at.
Yep, Ben DuBose on Twitter, RocketsWire, and the Logger Line on Twitter, and rocketswire.usatoday.com for all your daily Houston Rockets news coverage.
That's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Rockets. As always, thanks so much for checking out the show. Remember, the best way to help us grow the show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing. Like, subscribe, and comment on YouTube. Subscribe to the daily Locked On Rockets newsletter. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.